October 1987 turned out to be extremely gloomy. The gray sky seemed to hang over the ground, promising endless rains that could wash out all the roads and the souls of the townspeople. A cold, piercing wind cut my cheeks, forcing me to hurry home so as not to fall into the clutches of the incipient cold. In this small provincial town, almost lost in the boundless expanses of the Soviet Union, no one expected a change. Even the timid rays of glasnost, which were rumored to have already appeared somewhere, did not break through the layered veil of distrust here. People lived in a daily routine, listening to the radio out of the corner of their ears, where cheerful presenters talked about the achievements of the country, and diligently not delving into what worried neighbors were saying about strange events on the outskirts of the city. In the evenings, the streets were empty, as if someone invisible was giving the command to everyone to go home, turn off the lights, and not look out the windows. Rusty lanterns creaked, occasionally flashing with dim, flickering light. In the distance, one could see the dark silhouettes of high-rise buildings, built close together and similar to each other, as if equally designed panel cells for people. There were often faces outside the windows of these houses, but when they tried to peer in, they immediately disappeared behind the curtains. The city seemed to be lingering, holding its breath, waiting for something that could break the usual course of things. Among the locals, there were whispers about a mysterious place on the outskirts, a dilapidated building with a signboard, Institute of Radar. At one time, this institute was engaged in research, but all developments have long been curtailed and the staff has been reduced. However, in the last couple of months, some people have seen people in military uniforms there. A new metal lock has been added to the gate, and the old fence has been replaced with a tall iron one. Several teenagers tried to get into the territory, but they ran into gloomy men who were unfriendly and were on uniform duty, although there were no chevrons on their jackets. The teenagers returned, scared and excited. They swore that there were strange boxes in the depths of the courtyard, and lights were on the upper floors even at night. Soon, pets began to disappear in the city. Either the cat would not return from an evening walk, or the dog would disappear from the yard without a trace. Some attributed it to hungry stray dogs, but in quiet conversations they recalled that very place behind the fence. Even more confusing were the mysterious flashes of light that were noticed by several drivers driving past the institute late. Everyone was terrified of the unknown. The townspeople understood that military secrets were commonplace, but here, everything seemed many times more terrifying than the usual tests of some kind of radar or new equipment. It's like there's something behind the thick walls that makes your blood run cold. The wind was already sweeping the streets with might and main, driving fallen leaves into alleys and doorways. Soon, rains were promised that could flood the damp basements of the Khrushchev buildings, and with them, the basement of the institute itself. None of the townspeople had any idea how important and terrible things were happening behind the concrete walls on the outskirts. They didn't know yet that they were only a couple of kilometers away from the dark mystery. Perhaps someone has already had a feeling that this autumn will not be like the previous ones. It was as if an invisible force was gathering clouds, not only in the sky, but also in the hearts of people. The air smelled of a thunderstorm that was coming and could turn into a real nightmare for anyone who dared to look behind the veil of secrecy. In the first days of October, a truck covered with a tarp appeared at the gates of the Radar Institute, followed by a clang as the wrought iron gates swung open. Several soldiers in gray greatcoats, caps pulled tightly over their foreheads, silently parted, allowing the car to enter the courtyard. Rumors about the arrival of the mysterious transport quickly spread throughout the city, because any arrival of the military is rare here, and even more so at night. The crates, bathed in cold moonlight, were unloaded carefully, as if there was something fragile or priceless inside. In the village near the institute, it was rumored that a secret order had been sent down from above, and now everyone who works in this building has received a security non-disclosure agreement. A few days later, New faces began to appear behind the high metal fence. Among them was a thin but fit man in a raincoat who acted as if every stone in the area belonged to him personally. One of the guards tried to call him Colonel, but no one else knew anything about him. Other visitors wore white coats, but they carried themselves with an incomprehensible official arrogance, as if they were doctors with a military rank. They entered the building through a separate entrance on the side, and were always accompanied by men with machine guns on their shoulders. Generators were constantly humming inside. New cables were being laid. It seemed that some kind of large-scale preparation for the experiment or testing was underway. Employees who had worked at the Institute for a long time were warned harshly. It is strictly forbidden to talk about what is happening outside the walls. Some of them would have been happy to tell at least something, but they were forced to change their rhetoric to, "I don't know anything." However, the tense faces spoke for themselves. After some time, strange devices resembling large metal chambers, wrapped with dozens of wires, were moved from the corridors to a local warehouse. Someone said that these were magnetron installations for long-range communication, but in fact, no one really understood what kind of device it was. Such a technique was not common to either the engineers or the scientists who stayed here. Rumors are the only force that even the loudest orders cannot stifle, and this time they multiplied like weeds. Some talked about a new top-secret radar capable of detecting the slightest sound from tens of kilometers away. Others are about the interceptor of cosmic signals, which allegedly searches for signals from alien civilizations. Still others, the most daring, started a story that a spherical object was stored in one of the garages of the Institute, covered with symbols that could not be deciphered, and that it was he who was brought in at night along with the boxes. No one, of course, could confirm this with facts, but the stories grew, feeding on fears and secrets that seemed to come straight from the ground. In one of the closed offices, where the gloomy lighting left half the room flooded in semi-darkness, several officers and a couple of scientists in neat suits and freshly painted shoes were sitting at a metal table. At the head of the table was the thin man in the raincoat, whom everyone called Colonel Smirnov. He was dissatisfied with flipping through papers covered with secret and special importance stamps, and periodically checked them against brief notes in a battered notebook. On the agenda is a plan for upcoming experiments. Scientists, under the quiet rustle of the pages, reported that the object probably has biological features, but so far it does not show aggression. However, an extended set of analyses will be required to obtain reliable data. The colonel nodded coldly, drumming his fingers on the table. His voice sounded like the blows of a hammer, firm, short, without a shadow of doubt. Many of the people present in the office understood that the extended set of analyses meant a whole range of cruel techniques that could otherwise be called torture. But they are all soldiers of the system, trapped in bureaucracy and orders that reflect the interests of not only the KGB, but also the very top in Moscow. To object to the colonel was to endanger not only his own career, but also his freedom, and possibly his life. At the same time, some of the scientists had vague doubts. If they were dealing with an intelligent being or an object of extraterrestrial origin, would they risk losing a unique chance? Such thoughts passed like a shadow in their gazes, but none of them dared to say it openly. Meanwhile, the hum outside the Institute grew louder. The roar of generators, the clang of metal, the loud crackle of welding. Everything indicated that non-stop work was underway here. The new equipment was installed in special sealed chambers painted lead gray. Rumor has it that even on night shifts, people did not leave the building, preferring to take a short nap right on the cots so as not to waste time. The workers of the engineering teams mounted video recording and sound insulation systems with their last efforts. It looked as if something more than an ordinary laboratory was being prepared in the room, almost a bunker. With each passing day, the atmosphere resembled a ball of posturing restraint, behind which lies a real panic. One could only wonder what was more in these people, the curiosity of researchers, or ruthless obedience to orders. The townspeople saw a glimpse of military equipment behind the fence and began to make even crazier guesses, from preparing weapons against NATO to finally building a rocket to fly to Mars. However, the strangest whisper, about some kind of live cargo, did not subside. It was as if several guards, terrified beyond measure, had hinted to their friends about something that did not fit into any framework of ordinary military secrecy. "They have something unkind there, something that they are afraid to touch themselves," the old ladies repeated, crossing themselves at the entrances. And the more everyone tried to ignore that whisper, the deeper the fear ate into people's souls. The city was preparing for a long, chilly autumn. Coal and firewood reserves, clogged balconies with peeling doors, old infrastructure. Everything indicated that this year it would have to survive in the usual mode, if only the winter would pass. But no one had guessed yet that the real frosts would come not from outside, but from the depths of the concrete walls on the outskirts. With each passing day, as the gray rain flew over the city like thick clouds, the tension grew. It seemed that this whole thing with the Institute was not some kind of distant conspiracy, but a terrible harbinger of events that could shake up the usual way of life. So, in the autumn dampness, when the wind knocked on the windows and drove wet leaves along the asphalt, a secret project was gaining momentum at the Radar Institute, in which mystery and fear intertwined to give rise to the most terrifying chapter in the history of this inconspicuous town. And no one outside knew yet what a terrible price this sudden order from above would turn out to be. When Anton Kudrov, a maintenance technician, first went down to the basement of the Institute to check the power supply, he could not have known that this would be the beginning of his personal disaster. The basement, with its low ceilings and intertwining wires, always made him feel uncomfortable. There was something vague and sinister about this place, hidden in the shadows, where the lamplight barely penetrated the dense darkness. There was nothing unusual about his business, a standard check of old systems. However, something was wrong today. Already halfway to the shield, behind some kind of strange whistling wire, he heard a strange sound. Thin, as if bitten by a cold wind, but at the same time disturbing all the harmony of silence. A creaking sound, as if someone was asking for help from inside the iron door. Anton's heart began to beat faster. He knew it shouldn't have been audible. There was usually nothing in the basement except the common smells of dust and dampness. Not understanding what made him approach, the technician was led by an inner impulse, either curiosity or a feeling that he might find something important here. He slowly approached a massive metal door that led to one of the enclosed rooms of the Institute, which were not marked on the plans. Fragments of stories about the strange events that had taken place in recent months were spinning in his head. The gossip that something was wrong here was complemented by visions of a missing cat and dogs that occasionally struck his mind. Without stopping, Anton opened the door a crack. Narrow, liquid rays of light, making their way through a pair of bulbs on the ceiling, illuminated her. There was something unnatural inside, a creature shaped like a human, but whose features were completely different. Her cheeks were too sunken, her skin looked like it was covered with mold, and her dark eyes pierced someone who dared to look into those dark pupils. It was sitting on a straw mat in a corner, physically absent, but radiating some kind of strange auric atmosphere that sometimes overshadowed the senses, then forced them into a state of acute, all-consuming sensation. She was looking right at him, without words, without sound, but with such bewilderment and, perhaps, fear that Anton felt that someone or something had come for him. My heart was beating so fast that the pounding sensation seemed to resonate in my temples. Only now did he understand why everyone around him had been silent about the creature for so long. It was not just alien, but so dangerous that watching it was disturbing and heartfelt. Anton hardly knew how to deal with what was in front of him. He could have closed the door and left, but something in his gut stopped that impulse. Maybe he was ready to face what he didn't understand. His eyes met the creature's, and even when he was shocked, he could feel the magnetism of that gaze binding him. He didn't understand what kind of contact it was, but maybe it was necessary, albeit unconsciously. For 11 seconds, when the Institute finally completed the installation of strange metal cameras, trailing wires and devices with incomprehensible symbols, the interior began to resemble a fantasy film. The corridors were lit by dim light bulbs, making their long shadows constantly dance on the walls. People moved quickly and silently, trying not to make eye contact. Everyone understood that everyone was now required to obey orders as much as possible and ask a minimum of questions. But the silence only created more and more gloomy suspicions, especially among those employees who were not directly involved in the project. Anton Kudrov, a young technician, was assigned to monitor the power supply at the very bottom of the building, where the basement and pumping units were located. He had been working under this very non-disclosure agreement for several weeks now, and every day he felt the funnel of anxiety shrink around him. He was given a special key that allows him to enter separate rooms that were previously closed. It was because of this key that Anton began to realize that participation in the experiments was much more extensive than it seemed. Somewhere in the depths of the basement, generators were working, supplying energy to the latest installations, and in some places there were heavy doors with red lights on the signs. From time to time, he could hear short metallic clanks, similar to automatic locks, and these sounds were always followed by a dull silence, which made Anton feel like he was the only living person in the corridor. One night, when he had to stay on shift longer than usual, Anton walked around the main nodes and was about to return to his break room when he noticed a faint glimmer of light from behind one of the doors. Previously, this door was tightly closed, but now it was ajar, as if someone had forgotten to turn the lock. Anton froze, hesitating between curiosity and fear. He had no direct orders to look there, and in general, everyone at the Institute understood that unnecessary questions should not be asked. But still, against the background of the general disturbing atmosphere, he wanted to find a logical explanation for these mysterious noises and strange instructions from above. Stepping through the threshold, he found himself in a room that resembled a small laboratory. In the center stood a massive metal box, similar to an aquarium with darkened walls, wires stretched along the sides, and indicator lights barely flickered inside. Nearby, medical instruments and stacks of papers marked confidential lay on tables. Anton listened carefully. The space seemed to be saturated with an echoing emptiness. There was only a faint hiss, as if a ventilation system or some kind of sensors were working inside the box. He was about to retreat when he heard a soft sound like a groan. It was thin, barely audible, but there was something in his intonation that went beyond the ordinary human voice. Anton froze. His heart leapt into his throat. After all, there really was someone here. The technician was overcome by curiosity mixed with panic. Perhaps this is a person who feels bad, or... But suddenly he felt something inside him telling him, "This is not a man." And this realization pierced him like an electric shock. Steeling himself, he took a couple more steps forward and went to the dashboard. It consisted of a multitude of switches, buttons, and tiny screens with running numbers that partly resembled medical indicators. Heart rate, temperature, blood pressure, but the ranges and values looked strange. Anton ran his hand over the cool metal and looked around. There were no traces of scientists or military around, and there wasn't even a guard in sight. It was as if everyone had left the place at once, leaving the object locked up, but without turning off the equipment. A rustle behind him made him turn around. A vague figure appeared in the opaque glass behind the glass wall of the box, judging by its outlines, slightly elongated and unnaturally thin. Anton's eyes widened. He couldn't explain to himself what he was seeing, but he was sure that this was a creature he would never meet on the street or in the woods. It was moving, as if trying to attract attention to itself or get out of a confined space. And the sound, like a groan, came again. Now it was clearly a request for help, or at least a plea for contact. Anton's pulse was pounding so hard that it seemed like the air was vibrating. He leaned against the box for a moment, as if trying to feel if this creature was alive and how to talk to it. Surprisingly, at that moment, the horror disappeared. Pity and an unknown craving for understanding took its place. Anton couldn't get rid of the feeling that the creature was trying to tell him something. But as soon as he strained his ears, the warning light at the entrance came on, and 2 armed guards burst into the room. Their barking voices echoed off the walls. "Stop! Don't move!" Anton raised his hands, taking a step back. He clearly saw the guards take a quick glance at the panel, at the side door leading to another part of the laboratory. It seems that his presence here was the most serious violation. The technician tried to explain that he had heard strange noises and was worried if there was a person there who was unwell, but the guards only said that he had no right to come here, and demanded to go with them. As Anton left the lab, he noticed that the creature remained in the box, emitting an unusual dim glow. In those few seconds, something invisible passed between him and the creature, either a short impulse of understanding or a call. The guards pushed him into the corridor, where 2 other employees were already waiting to escort the intruder to his superiors. Anton felt his hands and feet tremble, but deep down there was a sharp feeling. He had seen something that no ordinary person should have known, and it seems that this something itself wanted to be noticed. As Anton was led down the corridor, he caught a glimpse of another detail that made his heart sink. There was a steel table behind one of the ajar doors, and surgical lamps hung above it. Straps or tourniquets hung from the surface of the table, which were clearly not intended for the treatment of typical wounds. He didn't know exactly what kind of procedure was going on in this room, but his hunch was frighteningly clear. A place for experiments was being prepared here, or have already conducted them. In the following hours, Anton was interrogated, finding out how and why he ended up in a secret zone. He answered all the questions the same way. He heard a strange sound, got scared, decided to check. The KGB officers in whose presence the interrogation took place frowned at the guy, as if they saw a potential spy in front of them. But he looked so sincere and scared that in the end they let him go, wagging a finger and threatening major trouble if he blabbed. Anton left the office feeling as if he had escaped from a death trap. The image of the creature behind the wall of the box was constantly in front of my eyes, its unnatural outlines blurred in the weak light, and the soft call that cut through the dead silence. He tried to convince himself that everything might have appeared in the light of the night shift, fatigue and loss of vigilance. But doubt has already settled inside. It is unlikely that the human imagination is capable of inventing such realistic details. Moreover, every fold of that strange, smooth skin, every curve of the figure, every metallic gleam on the devices was imprinted in his memory. Back in his break room, Anton sat on a chair for a long time, staring at the wall. His thoughts led him into a maze of questions. What kind of creature was it? Where did it come from? Is it really dangerous, or are the people around it just afraid of what they don't understand? And most importantly, what is the leadership willing to do to force this creature to reveal its secrets? Thus began his first, as yet unconscious but distinct contact with what was secretly happening within the walls of the Institute. And although Anton did not know what his curiosity would lead to, he could no longer deviate from the terrible truth. Feeling the quiet call of an unknown being and realizing that things were much scarier in this place than a simple secret military experiment. Perhaps he was the only person that the creature had tried to trust, and that filled him with a new, disturbing determination mixed with overwhelming fear. After the night shift and the unpleasant interrogation, Anton Kudrov tried to keep a low profile, carry out routine tasks, without interfering in anything once again. But thoughts of that creature haunted him. When he closed his eyes before going to sleep, the outlines of the mysterious silhouette, those strange moaning sounds, and the flickering indicators on the devices rose up before him again. His stomach was churning with conflicting feelings. He knew that taking a chance and being curious would get him into serious trouble, but to remain in the dark and pretend that nothing had happened was unbearable. Meanwhile, new oddities began to occur in the city. Locals were increasingly complaining about missing pets. Some even swore that they had seen glowing lights at night, similar to warning flashes in the sky. Newspapers were silent, but in private conversations people scared each other with stories about aliens, or that the military was conducting experiments with radioactive substances. It is in this atmosphere of disturbing speculation that the craziest rumors are born. Some claimed to have heard a terrifying roar from behind the fence of the institute, while others were sure that someone was flying a flying saucer there at night. But most of them just shrugged their shoulders and tried not to think about what was happening on the outskirts. Soon, a new man appeared in the town. A journalist who had come on a business trip from a neighboring region. His name was Gordon, and he introduced himself as a correspondent for an independent regional newspaper. He quickly got his bearings, began asking locals about recent incidents, behaved amicably, and sometimes bribed his interlocutors with cigarettes and scarce coffee. Unlike the vast majority, Gordon was not afraid to show interest in the Institute of Radar. On the contrary, he provoked people to talk in every possible way. It was as if he was looking for a thread to unravel a big tangle. Some of the old ladies at the entrances then whispered, "Isn't he from the KGB, this Gordon?" But those who talked to him more closely understood that there was something about him that was genuinely hungry for the truth, the kind of perseverance inherent in people who would not stop until they got to the bottom of it. One evening, Gordon managed to get Anton to talk at the entrance to the department store. The journalist approached him with a familiar question. "Do you know what's going on at this institute? They say they saw strange lights from there." Anton wanted to laugh it off or refer to the fact that they say it's just a protected area, nothing special. But there was something in Gordon's eyes that made it impossible to lie. Perhaps it was an understanding that the interlocutor himself did not believe in his own "everything is fine," or some kind of intuitive sensitivity. As a result, Anton threw out a short phrase. "Don't go there, if you don't want problems." He said it, and left quickly, so as not to give himself away. However, Gordon felt that this young man might be the key to the mystery. A few days later, they happened to cross paths again, this time late in the evening, when Anton was returning from his shift. It was an overcast night over the city, and the distant streetlights barely illuminated the wet asphalt. Gordon was waiting for the technician at the turn, came out of the shadows to meet him, and called softly by name. Anton started in surprise, looked around, fearing to see KGB agents somewhere nearby. But there was no one there. The journalist suggested that they walk and talk on neutral territory. In general, they found themselves on a deserted bench next to an old park, where the branching crowns of trees seemed menacing silhouettes in the light of the moon. Anton, having resisted for a long time, nevertheless shared some of his guesses, trying not to go into details. He hinted that he had seen something that clearly did not belong to human nature, but he was afraid to say what exactly. Gordon listened intently, without interrupting, only occasionally clarifying details. The journalist, according to his informants, had already heard about a possible guest from outer space, but he honestly admitted that he had not taken it seriously until now. It sounded too incredible. Now, seeing the fear in Anton's eyes, Gordon understood that everything here was much deeper than the banal army experiments. Back at his rented apartment, Gordon frantically wrote down what he had heard in a notebook. It became clear to him that secret experiments were being conducted at the institute on some kind of object, possibly a living being. At the same time, the journalist recalled incomprehensible stories from other places where unidentified debris was allegedly found. Everything indicated that the military could be studying alien technologies. However, Gordon did not understand why everything was so tightly classified and what was so special about this object. But he clearly imagined that if the whole country found out about such an experiment, there would be a scandal of unprecedented proportions. He felt that there was a real sensation around this news, capable of overturning all ideas about reality. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the institute continued to change. Some employees began to get noticeably nervous, especially after one of the laboratory assistants disappeared without leaving a note or a warning about transfer to another institution. It was rumored that he had been taken somewhere by people in civilian clothes, allegedly because of a violation of the secrecy regime. No one wanted to discuss this topic out loud, realizing that it could cost them their jobs or even their freedom. But a wandering fear seemed to take over the corridors. Conversations went on in low voices. Everyone feared for their safety, and round-the-clock patrols were intensified in the laboratories. Anton once again had a chance to encounter the same creature for a moment. This time he was being led down a corridor in a transparent capsule surrounded by guards and several people in white coats. The guy was standing around the corner, trying not to lean out, but he managed to notice a faint glow inside the capsule and heard barely discernible wheezing, like a crippled groan. However, he was most struck by the expression on the scientists' faces. It was a mixture of horror and unhealthy interest, reminiscent of the cold excitement of a predator. No one paid attention to the fact that the creature, judging by the plaintive sound, was suffering. Anton was shaking with rage and fear. He felt sorry for this creature, whose pain no one seemed to want to see. He felt again that this was not just an animal or a research subject. Perhaps there was a mind inside, the same living thought. But what if this thought is capable of responding? A man in a KGB uniform suddenly appeared next to Anton, the same officer who had once interrogated him. He frowned when he saw the tech guy, but apparently he decided not to make a fuss. He just threw out an icy warning. "You know what you're in for if you go where you shouldn't. Do your job and keep quiet." Anton felt a desperate courage awakening inside. He was no longer ready to meekly follow commands, knowing that a living being was suffering somewhere nearby. Nevertheless, he was well aware of how great the threat was. A revolt against the KGB system could result in not only dismissal, but also a prison sentence, and sometimes much more terrible consequences. Soon, Anton arranged a new meeting with Gordon, hoping that together they could somehow find out the truth and, perhaps, save this creature from cruel experiments. The journalist was extremely careful. He did not come to the agreed place directly, but, like a spy, wandered through the streets, looking around. When they met, Gordon did not hide the fact that he also had concerns about being under the hood of the special services, because he had already started making requests to archives, local authorities, and even somewhere in Moscow, hoping to stumble upon documents confirming his suspicions. So far, without success. But he began to see strange personalities on the horizon, clearly trying to keep track of his every move. Anton and Gordon discussed a plan to try to infiltrate the institute, or at least get one of the staff to let it slip. But already during the conversation we realized how risky it is. The journalist dreamed of taking this story outside, writing an article that would amaze the whole country, but at the same time, he was well aware that Soviet censorship, and even more so the KGB, would never miss such a thing. To publish such information, an option was needed with the West, or at least with some kind of unofficial channel. But who will decide? Anxiety was rampant, and everyone felt like a pawn on a dangerous chessboard. Meanwhile, the Institute was already preparing for new challenges. An urgent order came from Moscow, demanding to speed up the work and provide reports on the initial contact at the end of the week. The specialists were instructed to extract maximum information about the nature of the creature by any means, using methods that were officially designated as experimental interaction. On the sidelines, it was called more harshly, remove all indications, even if you have to use force or chemical treatment. So the greedy desire for a scientific breakthrough and the paranoid fear of any enemy intervention merged into a single cocktail that threatened to destroy not only the fate of Anton and Gordon, but also the creature itself. A mysterious alien, perhaps trying to understand or establish a dialogue. However, In the scary rooms of the Institute, they were not going to talk, but to conduct experiments. And every next day brought all the participants closer to the fatal line, beyond which there was no turning back.